I'm Isabelle Gonthier, Chief Assessment Officer at PSI Services, and I invite you to delve deep into the world of testing with me. Every episode, I'll be on the virtual couch with experts from the testing industry, engaging in conversations about the latest developments in our field. Your quest for testing knowledge starts here. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our Tried and Tested podcast. I have the pleasure today of meeting with Jim Harris. He's the #1 international best-selling author, and I'm so pleased to be here in Toronto to be able to talk about disruptions, innovation, AI. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation just because Jim has such an amazing perspective. So welcome to our podcast, Jim.
I'm so excited to be on.
This is awesome. So we typically ask our guests to kind of talk a little bit about how they got into assessment and credentialing. But I think for you, what I would want to know, maybe turn that question around a little bit and ask you, what does assessment mean to you and how it has impacted your life?
Well, assessment impacts all of us, whether we know it or not. If I go and see the doctor, assessment is impacting my life. If I see a physiotherapist, anybody, if I get in an Uber, the assessment of is this a good driver to get the driver's license. So assessment affects all aspects of our lives, whether we know it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of what makes it so interesting and a topic of conversation. Even like some people ask me sometimes what I do, like what is my job? What do I do in life? And then I exactly use the examples around, you think about a nurse, think about a doctor, and they need to get licensed. And to get licensed, they need to be assessed. So the impact of that assessment is massive in so many ways. And now a short break. Hello, tried and tested listeners and fellow testing enthusiasts. I'm Isabelle Gonthier, your guide through the fascinating world of credentialing. Each week, we dive deep with expert guests to explore the hottest topics in certification and licensure testing. If you're enjoying our journey through lifelong learning and innovation, take a moment to subscribe wherever you get your podcast. And if you know someone passionate about testing or curious about the latest testing trends, why not share this podcast with them? It might just be the inspiration they need. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our community. Remember, sharing knowledge is one of the best ways to grow our industry together. Keep listening. So, I mentioned as we were introducing the topic and having you on the podcast is really sort of like looking at the impact of AI. And all we talk about is AI. I do realize that, but it is a critical topic. When we were discussing earlier, I was saying it's a topic of the century, and I think it is. So, as we are thinking about how AI is transforming industries, how do you see that reshaping potentially the assessment landscape? How do you think like AI-driven assessments could become actually the norm moving forward? So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
So first off, I want to look at how can AI impact education and time to competence, because that in turn will inform assessment.
Yes.
So I can pay $5,000 to take courses at community colleges on how to use Python, the most widely used computer programming language in the world. Or I can go to ChatGPT and say, what is the first thing I need to do to learn Python? And it will tell me. And I can go back and forth in an iterative process at the learner's speed and learn Python instead of paying $5,000. So this is revolutionary for the education world. Second example is I can stack multiple AIs. Mm-hmm. So I know a student, I know his father, who he is using Otter to transcribe his lectures at university. Mm-hmm. And Otter takes every word and transcribes it in real time. And then at the end can give you a summary of the lecture. And what he then does is says, well, these 3 points in the lecture I didn't understand. So he cuts and pastes them into ChatGPT and says, explain these 3 points in a way that a 12-year-old could understand them. And it does. And then say, what are 3 learning tools I could use to understand each point. So here he's using Otter for real-time transcription overlaid with ChatGPT for education. So he's using these tools, they're freemium models, right? I can do 600 minutes of Otter for free and then decide if I like it.
Very accessible.
And I can use ChatGPT Forever in 3.5 for free. So this is radical. I began studying AI in 1997 when Gary Kasparov was beaten by IBM's Deep Blue. Now, that shocked the chess world. He was the world chess champion. It shocked the world. But that was a $100 million project, which meant AI was only the purview of deep-pocketed companies with deep expertise.
Yeah, exactly.
But what we're seeing now is the democratization of AI because it's been demonetized. If it's free for 600 minutes with Otter, boom. So how can this change education? I was at a conference and recently, and many conferences will have 6 booths at the back with real-time translation. And there's 2 human translators per booth. Well, a 3-day conference for 300 people will cost $100,000. You also have to rent the equipment to listen. But there's something called Wordly that puts the audio of the conference into an AI and will translate into 120 languages. But doesn't just stop there. I was sitting next to a deaf French woman. And not only was she getting the audio, which she couldn't hear, she was getting the transcription in French.
Live.
So the speaker's speaking in English and she's learning in French. So how is this going to impact education and time to competence? So I see there can be a huge increase in time to competence, but that's going to change what its assessment is doing.
Yeah.
So I think the implications are profound. I want you to imagine, Isabelle, that I went to university and I didn't get any essays back and I didn't see the marks. I didn't get the midterms back. I didn't get my quiz back. I didn't at the end of the year even get finals back or a mark by subject. I just got one aggregate mark for all 5 subjects I took. How valuable would that mark be? It would have no value at all. I wouldn't know what I did well on, what I didn't do well on, what studying paid off. So one of the profound shifts, I think, is moving from a episodic one-time assessment to 1,000 assessments over my career.
Breaking into pieces.
Tiny little pieces. And one of the reasons this is going to be possible is because of the demonetization of AI. And I can also see assessments changing. Students, young people have never been more depressed and anxious than in the history of the world. There's a lot happening that we can worry about. And some of them don't pass their assessments just because they're nervous. So imagine customized assessments. The first question I get is full marks, 100%. And if they miss that, they get a second question that they're only going to get 80% for on that one question that's easier. They miss that. It goes to a 60% question, then a 40% question. Or imagine you start the other way. When I go to my eye doctor, he starts with really big letters that I can read, okay?
To get you started, give you confidence.
Oh, yeah, I'm feeling good. I got this. Oh, yeah, it's like 9 feet high. But he keeps making me read words or letters until I can't read anymore. And they figure out my competence in terms of vision by starting easy. So imagine customized assessments that still give you a relative grade between all your students, but the students aren't feeling stressed during the exam itself. So how could we use AI to remove the stress? Now, some people in assessment might freak out about this because rather than getting a big fee for one assessment at the end of my nursing career, when I pass or fail my written and then my practicum, I'm getting 1,000 points of assessment through my 5-year career as a nurse. So One bad thing is, we might see demonetization of our assessments. But the good news is we'll go from one assessment to 1,000 in each student's career.
Yeah, it's a massive paradigm shift in so many ways. And what I really appreciate about what you're saying is that thinking about it from an education standpoint, and to me, what I'm anchoring it into is that the access, how easy it is to actually have access, where before, it was reserved to it wasn't for the masses, but now it is. So the opportunity that it brings from a learning and education standpoint for that access specifically, and the impact from an assessment standpoint where your reference anxiety is also an important point, because there's so much test anxiety that exists. It's massive. People are struggling with that. It's not because they necessarily don't know the subject, don't have the competence, but there's a blocker there. So by having like this bits and pieces along the way, still in the end, I'm a psychometrician at heart, so it's still in the end having a way to prove and demonstrate that the person has met the minimal level of competence required to be certified as a doctor, an engineer, and so on and so forth. That's critical. But having that paradigm shift, I think, is what AI brings to us.
And if I have had 1,000 points of assessment in my career at whatever profession I'm working to get certified for, I'm not nervous because I've been through it 1,000 times before, right? This is just another assessment.
Yeah.
So my question is, how does AI help us accelerate time to competence and increase the quality of every single profession that's being assessed? Because the feedback is embedded into the learning process. Like, why go 5 years or 7 years to become a doctor and then be told you can't be a doctor? That's a terrible outcome. So how do we do this as we go along? Often in assessment, we're thinking about proctoring and security. Well, there's now AIs that look at the retail floor space and say the behavior of this individual is suspicious because we see them putting things in their pocket. So we can look at the camera and the eye movements and see where people now, and we can use AIs to say, is this a normal pattern of thought? Like, this person's eyes go up to the right or up to the left when they're thinking about answering different questions, or this particular guy's view is always going to something that's posted on the wall.
Yeah.
So using AI for proctoring and security can be another enhancement.
Yeah, because it goes back to protecting the integrity, again, of the assessment, because the decisions that are being made at the end, however the assessment is built, whether it's at different points in time, needs to get to a result that you can validate and that you be comfortable that it means that the person has the level of competence. And I think when you say that from an AI standpoint, I really appreciate it, because we think about remote online proctoring that, has been used before the pandemic, but skyrocketed obviously through the pandemic, and it's there to stay. And that's where we have opportunities. There's two sides to the equation. There's the opportunity to additional protective measures to really identify trends of behaviors, patterns, and all that to determine, is it like a suspicious behavior or is it normal behavior type of situation? The flip side of it is that it creates opportunities and additional tools for people that are trying to game the system. So that's the balancing act there that we have to be conscious, and that's why it's always kind of trying to be ahead of the game. But AI brings many opportunities along those lines.
So I use an AI where I'll speak for 30 seconds. And for instance, I might say, we're seeing AI applications that have use cases where productivity is increased by 10x to 10,000x. That's staggering. And in my presentations, this will be a vertical panel. And then I advance the slide and there's another vertical panel, exactly the same, me, but now I'm speaking Mandarin. And you cannot tell the difference.
Like, it's Jim. Jim speaks Mandarin.
And then the next panel, I'm speaking German.
Wow.
And the first time I used this, there was a Mandarin speaker in the audience, and this Chinese woman came up to me and she said, I have to tell you, your Mandarin was perfect. Not just your accent, but the translation. And I said, "xie xie," which is thank you, the only word I know in Mandarin. And then a German woman came up and she said, "Your German was perfect." And I said, "Dankeschön," the only word I know in German. So the point is, both for education, what is the implication here in Toronto, where there are 200 mother tongues spoken? We are the most culturally diverse city in the world. We're the modern day Constantinople. So what are the implications for a company if I can reach both potential new employees in English or their language of choice? I worked with a franchise group that had convenience stores. The majority of their new franchisees didn't have English as their first language. So what is the time to competence if I can reach them, help them in their native language? And over time, they might shift to English, but maybe not. What are the implications for Canada to market to the world if I can take anything and translate it? Now, coming back to assessment, that deaf French woman I sat next to at a conference, imagine she could pass the test, for something, but not be working in, we have English and French everywhere, so it would be both languages. But imagine she was from Malaysia. Imagine she could become competent and pass as a doctor by having the test in Malaysian. Are we testing for English or are we testing for the competence as a doctor? Or both? And maybe it's both, but maybe you say, hey, you have your license to practice, but only with Indonesian speaking people, because we have a lot of Indonesians who don't have a doctor. So we're not going to enable you to practice in English, but we're going to be halfway to your certification. You can be a fully licensed doctor. You've passed the medical requirements, but the communication piece is just in Indonesian or Malaysian or whatever, right? So how do we stagger the certification, the assessment? So are we conflating language proficiency with medical proficiency? And how do we tease those two apart?
Yeah, and that is a very interesting topic, and I think probably also very controversial in so many ways. But that's the opportunity to bridge the gap and, again, force ourselves to think differently, because to your point, the argument is always being like, well, you need to be able, let's say you're in the US or you're in Canada, you have to be able to serve the population in the official languages. So because when you're a licensed doctor or licensed nurse, the expectation is that it's not about the language, it's about the competence. In this situation, though, it's kind of like you're flipping things around a little bit and saying, well, yeah, it is, but we're kind of saying it has to be English, it has to be French because of the country you're in, but who are you servicing? Who are you helping? But it kind of adds layers of complexity to the whole situation.
But where we are at is people can't get a family doctor.
True.
I want to give an analogous example. I was giving a presentation in London, UK, along with Edward de Bono, who's the world's leading guru in creativity. And he had a great example. People who drove taxis, the black cabs, had to spend 2 or 3 years learning the knowledge, unfunded. They're not being paid, because the final assessment was, I want you to drive to Spear Mews in SW5. And they had to not only know where Spear Mews was, which is only a 100-foot long street, tiny little street, but they had to know how to get there.
Yeah.
So you'd work 2-3 years before you could take the test for the knowledge, which meant they had no revenue and there was a limiting supply on the number of black cab taxi drivers. So he had an idea. Why don't you have a black cab which has a big question mark on the top? And everybody who's a Londoner who knows to get around just takes the question one, which is a driver learning, because the Londoner knows how to get around, just tells the driver, go here, go there, wherever. So you increase your supply of taxi cab drivers, but they're not competent yet on knowing how to navigate everywhere out of memory. Now, of course, all this goes away with GPS.
Well, exactly. You have these things like called cell phones where you can actually have in your pocket all the directions you want. Yeah.
Plus, it crowdsources the traffic jams and gives you alternative routes. Like I've been a Waze fan for 10 years. So the point is the taxi industry able to adjust? And this was pre-GPS. So is it able to adjust and think, how do we better serve Londoners who need a black cab? And is it, by the question mark, we can help proficient Londoners and they become the GPS for a driver who's learning. So they get revenue for the 2 or 3 years they're learning. So how do we help the profession, the public, the outcomes? So my same question would come back to this example about a Malaysian or an Indonesian doctor, right?
Yeah.
There's a Malaysian community that doesn't have access to doctors. We have Malaysian and Indonesian doctors. They're 2 separate countries, but I'm conflating them. I was just there at both of them. But we have people who are doctors, proficient by those standards, medical standards in those countries, who have that language, who could serve that community. And their license is just going to be for, say, Indonesian-speaking public in Canada who needs a doctor. And they could have an assistant who's Malaysian and speaks excellent English for the booking and everything like that. But the doctor themselves, this would address our shortage of doctors. But we have to be creative as either a medical profession or assessment professionals to propose this as an alternative and to say, hey, we have a shortage of doctors. You're going to become licensed to practice, but only for Malaysians or only for Indonesians. And once you pass your English proficiency, we'll then put you through the English one, and then your license will be for all people.
So it's thinking about that concept of licensing very, very, very differently. I think what it also brings into question as we think about the opportunities that, the technology brings into the equation here in this situation is from an equity standpoint. Because when we think about those internationally educated professionals that are going to a different country, they oftentimes have a profession from where they're from. They could be doctors, they could be nurses, they could be engineers, and they're coming to Canada or the US or the UK, and they have to prove their competence. They have to go through a process to align with the country they're in. But then again, thinking about how do we get for them to be able to demonstrate that competence in a way that allows them to expand beyond the traditional approach. So from an equity standpoint, there's definitely a lot of considerations there.
So one of the things that I find upsetting is when you have a highly competent engineer or doctor who is an Uber driver for 3 years because they aren't licensed to practice in Canada. So they're willing to do that because they want to emigrate here to Canada. We are so fortunate to live here in Canada. But we have this gap of people that we need in certain professions. Yeah. And the construction profession, for instance, there's a huge shortage of people, skilled tradespeople. So how do we accelerate time to acceptance around certain skilled professions where we have a serious lack?
For sure. It's a bit of a trade-off, though, because in a way, when you think about the whole concept of credentialing, it's about, first and foremost, the protection of the public. So you need to reconcile that, the actual needs that are stringent, critical, and important, balance that out with also the importance of ensuring that however you go about the process of assessing and demonstrating competence and providing a license to practice, to ensure that in the end, you're not going to create issues in terms of potential malpractice and so on and so forth. So that protection of the public element is what is sort of keeping things very tight around how we do things in credentialing. That being said, there's an opportunity to say, well, without necessarily throwing the baby out with the bathwater in a way around that super critical concept. How can we be more creative? How can we leverage the opportunities we have?
So imagine I'm away on holiday in Asia for 3.5 weeks, and my wife gets a stomach bug, like maybe a parasite, don't know. But the medical system as it exists, because of the doctor shortage, is not going to get to see her for a week and a half. Is that protecting the public, where she has to live with a bad symptom and consequences that may actually get worse over the 10 days she can't see a doctor? So protecting the public, I agree with the notion of competence. I'm not arguing with that, but we need to question our whole way of working, just like the black cab taxi drivers now with GPS. And I don't know, I haven't gone back and asked the taxi industry in the UK whether they now say, you don't have to spend 2 or 3 years getting the knowledge because GPS makes it all irrelevant. Have they changed? And I don't know the answer because I haven't checked, but have they changed given the technology has changed the landscape? And that's really the point I want to try and get at in the podcast here. How has technology, AI, intelligence, how should it change? What is the best outcome? Because we shouldn't be tied to our process. We should be tied to the outcomes, like protecting the public. So yes, we want certified people, but we also want to not have artificial barriers to
and I think that is an important point that you're making. And that's that, again, going back to that balancing act. So I agree with you. And to me, that's where it pushes the limit of thinking differently. And we're in an industry that's fairly traditional in their way of thinking, their approach. They're cautious for valid reasons. But, that's where we need to kind of be able to say, okay, well, let's have those conversations. This conversation is phenomenal that way because it forces us to think differently, ask questions, take a different angle, and not be stuck in our ways. So, and that's what I really appreciate about you, like in terms of how you are providing that information, putting in the questions in front of people to say, well, wait a minute here. This is all good. No question there. But what if? What if we were kind of like trying to blow this up a little bit to allow us to get to the next level?
So there's a story about Albert Einstein at Princeton giving an exam, and the proctor ran up to him and said, Dr. Einstein, there's a terrible, terrible mistake. The exam is exactly the same as last year's exam. And he says, yes, I know, but this year all the correct answers are different. So
it's a little scary.
So my question is, the question is, how do we best serve the public? This year, the answers may be different. And we as a profession, whether it's assessment or whether medical or taxi driver or certification, whatever, we have to say, given today's technology, what is the best way to achieve this outcome? And it may be different.
Yeah. What is, and I'm taking a bit of attention here, but you've mentioned earlier, like that you've been working, with AI for a number of years. Like this is not new. This is far from being new. There's newer elements of applications of how AI is being used that keeps coming up super quickly. How are you seeing that evolution? How are you seeing, like, in terms of even from an adoption standpoint, as you're having those conversations, what are your observations around people's open mind and perspective as we think about this as a very disruptive element of our current lives?
So first off, ChatGPT was released publicly on November 30th, 2022. And in the first 60 days had 100 million users adopt it. So it is the fastest adopted technology in world history.
Yes.
So for me, it is like the web revolution in 1993, which has transformed everything in our society and business and so on. But this revolution is happening at warp speed. So it's as profound, more profound because of the speed. So I look at, and we all think about ChatGPT because it's kind of the poster boy because everybody thinks about it. But there's image generation, there's video generation. There, as we talked about, you can stack AIs and get multiple new benefits by having many of them. And there are now more than 30,000 AI apps out there. So people think AI, ChatGPT, like that is so 2022.
We're now past that.
Yeah. So, and it's head spinning the different applications. It's going to affect every function. So HR, marketing, sales, supply chain and logistics. So it's going to affect every function in an organization. Yeah. It's going to affect every profession. So the real question is, and I think the questions are more important than the answers, this notion of continually questioning is what is really key. We are committed to the mission of serving and protecting the public. What is, in today's context, the best way to do that? And so assessment has to keep coming back. Education has to keep coming back. So there's some professors in universities who have said you can never use AI. And to me, that's like in 1900 saying you can't use the telephone because the telegraph is just peachy keen. You are actually disadvantaging both the students and their future employers. Yes, because BCG, Boston Consulting Group, did a study with Harvard where they gave ChatGPT 4 to 759 white-collar consultants. And what happened was the quality or the quantity of their work improved 12%, 12% higher output at 25% higher speed and 40% higher quality. So when I hear either CEOs or companies or industries say we will never use AI, to me that's like saying we will not allow our people to have superpowers. Yeah. We don't want them to be 40% more productive. And if you're running a $100 million company, whatever industry, if you could get a 40% uplift, that's worth $40 million.
It is massive.
Should we not say, let's begin exploring how we can do it? Now, we need to understand guardrails and security and data privacy and all these things. Yes, that goes without saying. But people will tell me, ChatGPT hallucinates. Well, here's a simple thing. ChatGPT 4 hallucinates half as much as 3.5, so from 10% to 5%. But you can begin to use these LLMs antagonistically. What do I mean? You get an answer in ChatGPT 4.0, and then you put it into Gemini and say, show me the deficiencies of this answer. And then from that, you put it into
full circle.
Anthropic's Claude or Perplexity. And really, you can shave off the spiky bits through an iterative process of what I call antagonistic LLM use. So there's so many tools and tricks, but you have to study this. And some people come to AI and they'll go to ChatGPT and they'll say, tell me everything I need to know about queens. And they get a terrible answer. And then they think, well, this LLM is stupid.
It's all about the prompts and the way you're asking the questions. You're evolving the questions and the elements you're looking for. It's an iterative process, an interactive process.
So I didn't give the LLM context. Am I talking about the recently deceased Queen of England? Am I talking about queen bees and their behavior in a beehive?
We're talking about Freddie Mercury.
Yes. Yeah. Are we talking about the band Queen? Are we talking about the history of playing cards? Am I talking about drag queens? I want to understand. Am I talking about the history of chess and how the queen moves on a board? So unaware, I have not provided the best context to my query for the LLM to give me a good response. And then I blame the LLM, unaware that my lack of expertise in this, and expertise, I want to say, if you take a 1-hour course in prompting and you can email me, by the way, jim@jimharris.com, and I'll send you this prompting course, or go to my website. But this can take you from an entry-level prompter to an 801 Ninja status. So here's a question for the assessment profession. Who is closest to the future? The 65-year-old CEO of an assessment firm who has his assistant print out all his emails so he can read them on the weekend, or an 18-year-old who's a new employee who's on Tinder? Who's the closest to the future? Mm-hmm. Who does all the strategic planning?
That's why you have to have diversity in how you're doing your strategic planning. Love it.
Yes. So how do we engage young people who might have a greater affinity to using some of these tools and are willing to go into them and explore with them, and then understand the guardrails of the assessment industry and how this new technology could improve what we do? So we need a blend of deep business wisdom with the new technical competencies, and we need to allow those technical competencies to challenge our business model.
Exactly. To kind of like challenge the status quo kind of forces the thinking. And some of the elements you were mentioning is that it kind of forces us to really leverage different types of skills. And that's what we need to get to that level, instead of just like learning by heart, regurgitating some information. It's not about that anymore in any way, shape, or form. Like, we're elevating what we're asking people to do. We're leveraging a different skill set. So again, that's the opportunity to continue to bridge that gap and leverage that technology to get to where we need to be.
So that just triggered for me, there's a system called Babylon. It's a medical system that came out of the UK, and here in Canada, TELUS was the one to first use it, and they've rebranded it as Teleth Health. But here's the problem. I come back from 3.5 week of traveling in Asia, and I have a parasite, right? I'm not feeling well, but my doctor, her schedule is so hard to get into. I'd have to wait 3 weeks with the parasite, but I can go online and book an appointment and get one today for 15 minutes by, in essence, Zoom with a medical doctor. And the camera is looking at my face and interpreting my reactions.
Skin tone and reaction.
And the doctor can say, oh, you look confused, and then explain. It's also asking or prompting the doctor to ask questions. Well, is the pain in your upper stomach or lower stomach? Lower stomach. If you have water, does it make it better or worse? And all these questions, as they're answered, change the probability of what my problem is. And so the questions are being prompted to the doctor on their screen. So they might not be an expert in parasites, but the AI is the expert, and working with the human doctor, they get to, and then at the end they say, well, it's, a 72% probability you have a parasite. And he says, go over to Life Labs and have this test, and it will be sent to them. And they say, okay, yes, they get the test in a day and a half. And then they say, go to your pharmacy and get this antibiotic, which will kill the bug in your stomach. So rather than wait 3 weeks to go see my doctor, then have a test, then go back 2 weeks later and suffer for 5 weeks, this allows me to do it better. So, right, AI is going to be very important to every single profession. And if we have a mindset that we can't use it, and by the way, Isabelle, twice as many Canadian employees fear AI as opposed to are excited about it. So they've seen the Terminator, with Skynet. They've seen iRobot and Ex Machina, and they fear AI, which Hollywood has sold us a dystopian view, right? Sells more movies. But I want to make a distinction between AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, and the AIs we've been talking about. AGI is like Skynet in the Terminator, where you say to it, the government of Canada says, we're going to empower you to make all financial decisions, all military decisions. We're going to take humans out of the loop. You just take over. That is AGI, and nobody's talking about that. Because if you said to an AGI, okay, you're empowered to do anything and solve climate crisis, very quickly the AI would say, you know what the real problem of climate? It's people. If we just kill all the people, we'll solve climate.
Which could be problematic.
It's true. That is an outcome, but we don't want that method. Okay. So nobody's talking about AGI here. We're talking about Otter and ChatGPT and other tools.
Yes.
So
tools is the key word here.
Yes.
Yeah.
So people have this fear and conflate it with AGI. And I have AGI concerns. I don't want an AGI running the government of Canada or the UN or military operations. So yes, there are AGI legitimate concerns, but don't conflate that with what we're talking about today.
No, I think that's an important point to make. So I appreciate that. So as we think about the future, as we think take your crystal ball, what do you think the assessment of the future looks like?
I think that a student becoming a nurse will have 1,000 points of assessment in their career. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe it'll only be 300.
But you know what? It's kind of the multi-points as opposed to a single point in time.
It's going to be multi-point and it's going to give them feedback, and it can be customized assessments, both in terms of testing to get a more accurate and remedial work. Okay, you want to have 100% next time. Here are the 6 areas you have to do further study, and here's study plans and ways of helping you.
The evolution, the interactive nature of the assessment in and of itself.
Yes. Yeah. And I listened to a university professor who said, the first thing I do with a new class is set up the rubric of how to get an F, a D, and an A. So for F, you miss classes. When you do come, you come late. You don't do the readings in advance. You don't submit your essays either on time or at all. This is going to be the behaviors you're going to do to get an F. I guarantee you. If you want to get a D or a C, here's what you would do. You come late. You haven't read the reading, maybe only half of it. You submit your essays late, you start writing them the night before. This kind of behavior results in a C. If you want an A, here's what you need to do. And set out the rubric for students up front, just based on behavior.
The behaviors, yeah.
And so if you follow these behaviors, you will get a higher mark than if you follow these behaviors. So we're going to lay it out and make it simple for you. So how do we take that kind of thinking and integrate it into our assessment to say, here are some remedial actions. Here's a rubric around remedial actions that you can take to take your current C rate and on our next of 300 assessments, bump it up to maybe an 80% or 90 or 100.
Yeah, to get you to where you need to be or where you want to be. Yeah. So this has been an amazing, fascinating conversation. As we wrap up this great podcast, any final piece of advice for our listeners?
Well, here's something I do with audiences. I say, grab a pen and as quickly as you can, write your name 3 times, and they do it. And then I say, switch hands with the pen. And now as quickly as you can, write your name 3 times. And there's a lot of laughter in the room, and it takes people a lot longer. And then I say, how were you feeling the second time? And people will say, awkward. I felt like a child again, and I say, imagine I told you have to write with the other hand the entire first day back at the office. How would you feel? I'd take the day off, So, or, imagine a whole week you have to do it. Oh, geez, So, here's the thing. We like to be in our comfort zone where we are competent because, we've spent years in our career developing our competence. Yeah. And when some new tool or way of working comes along, we feel like a child again. We are not comfortable being uncomfortable. And given these new tools and that they are so powerful and can have an uplift of 40%, on the assessment industry, if we take BCG's example in terms of quality and output and value, we have to embrace them, which means we have to develop a tolerance and a comfort for being uncomfortable. Now, we don't want to release things that are half-baked and, we want to protect our mission.
Yes.
But we have to explore these new tools because they are so powerful.
Yeah. Become comfortable being uncomfortable, basically. That's perfect. I love this. It's a great piece of advice. Well, Jim, thank you so much for your time, and more to come from you. I think that people can follow you. You've mentioned you have your website where you have lots of great information, and let's just keep it going.
Well, it's been such an honor to be on this. Love the work you're doing. People can also get to me on LinkedIn or Twitter, now X, and fantastique.
That sounds great. Merci beaucoup.
C'est ma plaisir.
Thank you.